I'm not going to say anything except that Jennifer will explain the work that she's reading, and she will talk about a few things, but then we're definitely going to open it up for Q&A, and I encourage you all to join in. And thanks a lot, and I'm just going to give it over to Jennifer.
Thank you all for coming. I hope you can hear. It seems like some people have to be far away. There could be like a floor thing if you felt comfortable. But so what I decided to do today, Kate asked me for a title, so there was the idea that I could write something new, but there was only like a month lead time, so that idea went away. And it was partly because the semester was starting, so I was too busy to do that. So I decided I was going to read from two different projects that are, one that's been finished for a couple of years and one that's ongoing. And the title that I gave her was There Are Things We Live Among, Notes on the Object World, which is the title of, many of you might recognize that phrase from Oppen. And the title is from this book of essays that I've been writing on the object world. So that's, what I'm going to do is read about 4 or 5 of those essays. And then I'm going to read a small chapbook that I wrote on Poetics, which is a kind of whole different project. But I think will speak directly to the question of poetry and poetics, which seems to be what a lot of this community is trying to think about. And then hopefully you will have, my writing will have generated questions or arguments or something that when we can have a discussion. All right. Something about this makes me feel you should start responding right away. Maybe it's just the format. Okay, the first thing I'm going to read is this book of essays, like I said, called There Are Things We Live Among. And the way that this project was begun was I translated a book by a French writer and intellectual named Jacqueline Risset called Sleep's Powers. And this was a short book of essays that she wrote. It was probably about 100 pages. Where she sort of thinks about sleep and the role of sleep in our life. And she, using Montaigne-style essays as her model, she sort of weaves from philosophical meditation, literary analysis, personal memory, anecdotes about her own sleeping experiences as a child, etc., very effortlessly. And I was really charmed by this book. I loved it, and obviously I wouldn't have put in the labor of translation if I didn't. But I also was just so intrigued by the form she was using, the short essay, the non-academic essay, the essay in which you quote from things, but you don't have to source them. You know, you can just sort of say them as though everyone knows. And the sense of writing into a community that you're speaking to an intellectual community, which I think in her milieu, she was part of the Telkel group in the 60s and has been in dialogue with the same kind of thinkers for many years. That's a very true statement, that she's writing to fellow intellectuals and writers that she knows, where in our circumstance it's so much more diverse and you can't assume knowledge. Like, you know, we all think once there was a time when you could assume that everyone in the room had read the same books. Now, obviously that's not true. But anyway, so that inspired me. So I thought, well, I want to write a book of essays, trying to use this form and see if I can put my voice in that form. But I didn't want to write about sleep because it doesn't generate as much thought for me as it did for her. It's not something that I don't have troubled sleep, and it doesn't. You know, I think people who can't sleep think about sleep a lot more than people who can, and. So I thought, well, what should I write about? And I thought privacy at first, because I'm very interested in the way privacy has changed. And I'm a very private person, even though in my writing, often that doesn't seem the case. And then I thought, no, not privacy. So then I was going to do memory. But then I was like, no, my poems talk about memory too much. I want to do something that I don't do in my poetry. So I decided to write about things. Which, you know, I do put things in my poetry and maybe even think about them. So this may be false, but it's a very big subject. Obviously, there are a lot of things. So it felt very generative in that way. So the essays I selected to read today are all deal directly with poetry in some way or another, or poets. This book does not necessarily stick to that model. I write a lot about novels and film and personal anecdotes and stories about my own life. So a mix of object choices for me to write about. Okay, so I'll just start. I'm going to read the opening essay, which starts with Oppen, who becomes the sort of genius of the book. And I'll also tell you that I wrote this, I'm still writing it, following Roland Barthes' method of the dossier. So instead of writing this essay and then that essay and the other essay, every time I enter a new topic of a new kind of category of things, I'll open a new dossier, and literally there'll be like a little folder on my desktop, and that will be a sort of line of inquiry. So I have, for example, so I don't know how I'm going to put it all together. It seems like a nightmare because I'll refer back to things, but I'm not sure where they are in the story. So hopefully some editor will notice, well, you know, you mentioned this, but that hasn't come yet, and things like that. So like I have a dossier on furniture, which I'm going to read from, a dossier on clothes, a dossier on sort of the Oppen dossier kind of goes from Oppen to Robinson Crusoe to Plato to Emerson. So I don't know what the logic behind that is, except for that I started this book really trying to think about why the philosophical tradition is so chooses to degrade the material world so much, and so I was kind of interested in that. And I have a dossier on dishes and et cetera, so you get the idea. And one on shoes, of course. All right, so I'll start with this. This is called The Mineral Fact. Are you familiar with Oppen, most of you? Yeah, I thought so. He's kind of made it now, finally. There are things we live among, and to see them is to know ourselves. So begins Of Being Numerous, George Oppen's culminating poem. From one perspective, it is a long meditation on the shipwreck of the singular, caused by the difficulty of somehow coming together as a species to see and know ourselves. Of Being Numerous as a utopian Marxist essay about community in a world of commerce, of things, but also as a record of failure, isolation, and the melancholia inherent in the mineral fact of being, ending in a hospital bed with the generic nurse being the last who will see him or touch him. Those are Oppen's lines. Oppen's tone is existentially pleading and run through with sadness. But if the singular is tragic, then what does Oppen mean by the phosphorescent and twice repeated line, the bright light of shipwreck? He has already raised the specter of Crusoe, the most famously singular literary character. Perhaps the opening lines give us a clue. Those opening lines, there are things we live among, and to see them is to know ourselves. The paradox of identity and materiality is that both are singular. Given that, what does it mean to be numerous? To be denied one's things? The of Oppen's title, Of Being Numerous, is nostalgic. Of, according to one dictionary, expresses, quote, the relationship between a part and a whole, between the individual and the collective, or the single life and the multitudinous city. Delving into another source, I read that, quote, of had already developed in Anglo-Saxon various uses in expressions involving the idea of moving or resulting from, unquote. In this etymology, the shipwreck of the singular is a result of being numerous. The nameless, faceless city. I am reminded of 19th century poets' fears of anonymity, Poe's Man of the Crowd, and Baudelaire's bent-over codgers, Les sept vieillards qui se multipliaient, which connects up with another tributary of this fascinating preposition, quote, indicating, this is more on of, indicating the material, substance, parts, or elements composing or used in making anything, i.e., what are we made out of? Of things? To believe so confirms and rejects the labor theory of value. To glorify the labor, whether skilled or unskilled, that goes into making things, we must glorify the things themselves. But what if those whose labor produce the things cannot afford to buy them? If the things we live among are never to be ours, how will we know ourselves? The problem, if we devalue the things, do we devalue the labor? At this point, I start thinking about the economy of poetry, where the things are very devalued, right? And the question of labor is very vexed. In Of Being Numerous, the things that help us know ourselves are not the cold architectural achievements of modernism, quote, a city of the corporations glassed in dreams, like the disorienting reflections of Tati's playtime maze, or the threatening helicopter overhead, the fly in the bottle, as Oppen calls it, but rather those things that, like stories, like language, grow more meaningful with use. Old apartments, the brick the eye picks that was waiting for us when we were born, the mark of history, the great stone pylon etched 1875, which leads Oppen to a definition of consciousness. It is something which has nothing to gain, which awaits nothing, which loves itself. It may have nothing to gain in the sense of advancement, but without those things around it, how shall it know and love itself? The existence of things taken in toto is indeed an unmanageable pantheon, but taken in fragments, one thing at a time, transforms into a living human story, a story, according to Oppen, of such solitude as we know. So that's sort of the opening essay that kind of starts the questions that I want to ask. And now I'm going to read you two from the dossier called Close. Somehow they connected up with poetry. A friend, in a very sweet email response to my memoir, The Middle Room, also adds, "Maybe I now know more than I need about people's clothes." I laugh upon reading this. Yes, perhaps such trivial details need not be included in the story of one's artistic development. But then I remember a legendary story about my grandmother, Frances Moxley, who died before I was born. Near the end of her life, this elegant woman, who had always struggled to keep her figure, was thin and frail, dying of stomach cancer, confined to bed. Her daughter-in-law, my mother Jo, was her final caretaker. Frances, knowing she doesn't have long to live, asks Jo a favor. "Will you go into my closet, take out each of my fine dresses, and bring them over to the bedside where I can see them?" "What for?" my mother wonders. "To bid each one farewell." Piece by piece, my grandmother says goodbye to her wardrobe. My mother told me this story repeatedly, always in a tone of delighted superiority, as if pleased to have her prejudice against Frances confirmed by the gift of this trivial, ridiculous parting gesture. "She was dying, and she thought about her clothes," my mother would exclaim. When our bodies are failing, is it necessary that we despise them, scorning former adornments and physical pleasures? When my own mother was dying, I remember her picking up a cat and burying her nose in the soft pelt. "I love the smell of cat's fur," she said, a simple pleasure in which all of life's small, sensuous joys seemed at that moment to concentrate. At no time is the personal, intimate nature of clothes more felt than when lending or borrowing them. Every teenage girl who wraps herself in the leather jacket of her beau knows this. The item of borrowed clothing carries the smell of its owner. Its ill fit gives you a curious awareness of your body, like being in someone else's skin. Lending a signature item out of love is of course different from lending a generic item out of need. A glamorous woman poet comes to give a reading at my university. Her luggage is lost. "May I borrow a toothbrush, something to sleep in, and some clean underwear?" The intimacy of the underwear gets lost in the loan. This is a practical request, not a personal one. Any connection to my identity in the item must be downplayed. By rights, I shouldn't loan my panties, but rather an extra pair that don't yet belong to anyone. But unlike with toothbrushes, I don't have a closet filled with unused emergency panties. I pick a scarcely worn, fairly new pair I don't have any particular fondness for. I find the thought of someone out there, a fellow poet, wearing my panties a bit embarrassing. Though she agrees to return the pair by mail, some loans, though neither party speak of it, are tacitly understood to be gifts. Okay, this one is called, that's a true story, by the way. This one's called,
This means I don't have to give you your panties.
this one's called The Poem's Wardrobe. Though when reading novels, we are not surprised to find descriptions of what the characters are wearing, we are less accustomed to seeing clothes described in poems. There are exceptions, of course. The liquefaction of Julia's glittering garments in Robert Herrick's poem is probably the most famous, and notable in that Julia's clothes stay on. Usually, when clothes show up in love poems, they are being removed. Wyatt's "When her loose gown from her shoulders did fall," or the gorgeous moment in Keats's The Eve of St. Agnes, when Madeline, quote, "loosens her fragrant bodice, by degrees her rich attire creeps rustling to her knees." It's like so great, isn't it? Okay. These instances are bound up with femininity and the trappings of gender performance. But what of clothes that aren't simply foreplay or a prop to be removed, clothes that define us? I've always been struck by the moment in Ted Berrigan's Red Shift, when about halfway through the poem he lists 3 people, a boy, a girl, and a painter. Though we get a feel for all 3, the only item of clothing mentioned belongs to the boy. And this is from Red Shift. I don't know if you folks know this poem. Not that practically a boy, serious in corduroy car coat, eyes penetrating the winter twilight at 6th and Bowery in 1961. That's just a teeny little excerpt. I'm surprised upon rereading to discover that the color of the coat is not mentioned, because in my mind I've always imagined it as brown. But why? Because it is winter? Or brown is a boyish color? In addition to the lovely alliterative run of corduroy car coat, Berrigan creates a great internal rhyme between boy and corduroy, a word which serendipitously includes a boy's name, enforcing the boyness of this character. Through this car coat, a car also comes into the poem, though the boy is standing on the street corner. But I imagine that were he to get into a car, it would be a 1961 model, perhaps a Chevy, with heavy metal doors and a hand gear shift behind a large steering wheel. In other words, the item of clothing not only gives us insight into who this boy is, casual, perhaps not dressed warmly enough for the season, it also evokes an era for which Red Shift is an elegy. There's a lot of people. I heard geese flying today overhead. It sounded kind of similar. Oh, do they? I heard the geese. I was like, wow, because I live in Maine, so it's not uncommon. But I was like, in Chicago, geese. Oh. Wow.
You get sick of the geese.
So it's like geese-hating culture. Okay, now I'm going to read you 2 essays from the dossier on furniture. So this one is just called Furniture.
Seems appropriate.
Oh, okay.
Given our setting.
I know. Well, this is a good piece I'm in, isn't it? Okay. While translating Jacqueline Risset's book, Sleep's Powers, I balk at the following title, Étrange Meubles, and meubles with no S. Okay? I know it means strange furniture, but in French, meuble is singular, meuble with an S, plural. The only way to render the singularity of this furniture in English is to add the awkward piece of before it. Feeling rather pouty about the whole thing, I settle for a strange piece of furniture, which is cumbersome and seems to lack the ambience of the moody étrange meuble. So furniture as a category makes up a whole, but the objects that belong to it can only be partial. A piece of something implies partialness as a piece of cake or a piece of the action. Perhaps our inability to have only one furniture in English is connected to the verb form. To be furnished or to furnish implies a completeness, to be decked out, filled with all that is necessary. You cannot justifiably call an apartment with one couch and nothing else furnished. The impossibility is in the etymology. A sampling from Webster's New International. Furniture, quote, the state of being equipped, as in armor or mind, supplies, outfit, equipment, articles constituting an equipment, as the armor or accoutrements of a knight, harness in comparison of a horse, curtains and coverlets of a bed, etc. Unquote. The concept of singularity does not exist in these examples. A couch alone is not furniture, but only a piece of it, just as a knight would not don a hauberk and then claim himself well furnished for battle. I'm sure you guys get that comparison, right? I like to use contemporary things so people understand. When the word appears in contemporary guise as the stuff we use to furnish home, couches, yes, but also beds, tables, desks, chairs, and so on, the relevant aspect is detachment. None are fixed in place. All can be moved. Furniture is distinct from fixtures. When used in the archaic sense of the furniture of one's mind, then the word provides an antidote to the idée fixe. We cannot hold furniture in our hands. We move among it, sit on it, allow it to cradle us. We abuse it as well. It is heavy and blocks our way. We need to work in tandem to move it. It robs us of our independence and encourages us towards stasis. Many years ago, shopping for couches with S, we walked through a huge warehouse filled with massive, squishy velour couches. When sitting in them, my feet don't touch the ground. I am a child, afraid of sinking like a game piece in between the cushions. These couches imply people and houses of Brobdingnagian proportions. They have drink holders and footrests, and their backs recline until almost flat. Furniture to die in, S says. Couch as coffin, comfort as death. Is this what William Carlos Williams means in his line from Spring and All, in my life the furniture eats me? It's such a great line, isn't it? The larger context tells a different story, and I'm going to quote from this passage in Spring and All. In my life the furniture eats me, the chairs, the floor, the walls, which heard your sobs, drank up my emotion, they which alone know everything, and snitched on us in the morning, unquote. The hospital furniture watches the doctor make love to a woman, a lively, transformative sex act that also seems vaguely cruel. The woman's sobs of pleasure, of sadness, soak through the walls, breaking the hospital to pieces. Their passion animates inanimate things, and then they themselves become those things. And now back to the poem. Everything, windows, chairs, obscenely drunk, spinning, white, blue, orange, hot with our passion. Your bed, I wrapped myself round you, I watched. You sobbed, you beat your pillow, you tore your hair, you dug your nails into your sides. I was your nightgown, I watched. And it's important, this poem is all flesh, the margin's all flesh, and then except for that last line, I watched, in which he indents it, and then he says I, and then he takes many, many spaces, and then he says watched, exclamation point. Woman as furniture eating the doctor, furniture as woman swallowing him up, furniture as snitch, betraying forbidden passion, the doctor himself as hospital bed wrapped around the patient, holding her. In my life, the furniture eats me moves from surrealist caprice to realist image, a Williams-esque realism of the imagination, which is painterly cubist full of motion and material. Spring and All is a relatively early work in Williams's oeuvre, written long before Patterson, and that revelatory formal moment in the descent when his poetic line slowly begins to move down the page with the grade of wide, gentle, rhythmic steps, the triadic foot. The ecstatic moment in the above excerpt, I, space, 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 watched, is an early indicator. The long spaces before and after the poetic lines in Williams's late work allow lineation to dominate over line endings. The line break becomes a line continuation, the space around it part of the composition. The furniture, as defined by the typesetter, small bits of metal placed around and between letters to provide the blank space, eats the poetic line, and in doing so changes it from a fixture to a fine, movable thing. So have you guys heard that definition of furniture as the stuff that typesetters, when they did letterpress, it was the pieces of the lead or whatever it is, the material that they put little squares to put in between the words, right, to make the space, because how else would you make the space? So that was called the furniture. So this is the last essay I'll read from this book, and this is called Table Talk. And it has a reference to the novelist Elizabeth Bowen in the first paragraph, and that's just because in the book, hopefully it'll go after the essay on Elizabeth Bowen, which I'm not reading to you. So it's not, there is a context. Table Talk. As Elizabeth Bowen knew, few humans are able to perceive the profound empathy of the object world. To most, objects appear silent and dead, mere furniture. Though all things, despite appearances and the limits of human perception, if we reduce the scale far enough, are by some definition alive. In the subatomic universe, we are told, every potential is actualized. But we, with our vulgar senses, cannot perceive this flurry of activity, at least not in any way we can account for within the confines of our linear narratives. When it comes to the physical world, we miss most of what transpires. including the flux of our own possessions. We can no more record their gradual aging than we can our own decrepitude, which, though primordial in pace, seems to overtake us with a time-lapse shock. Things once new are suddenly old. Though they have never been still, our instruments are sluggish. The object world, patient in the face of our agitation, helps us to reconstruct the story. It absorbs, mitigates, and silently records the vicissitudes of human passion, subject to our limits, attentive to the scene. Devin Johnston's poem, Packing Up, from his book Sources, captures this delicate cohesion. The central object of the poem is a piece of furniture, a tea table, about which we learn neither the dimensions nor circumference. This is the opening stanza of the poem. An Irish tea table someone took as spoils, no longer speaks, inured to use. Two short couplets. Let me just read those again. An Irish tea table someone took as spoils, no longer speaks, inured to use. In two short couplets, the poet gives us the history of an object. We learn that someone took it as spoils from its country of origin, Ireland. Suddenly we see a wave of Irish immigrants coming to the United States to escape the great famine of the mid-19th century. A tea table is a lovely object that conjures up images of afternoon entertaining. But is it a spoil? In such extreme historical circumstances, yes, it could have been stolen from a house of the dead, or more likely, the table has taken on great value as an object belonging to the wealth of pre-famine, pre-immigration life. Perhaps the table belonged to a family whose fortunes changed for the worse. Whatever its story, it is a vestige of an era that won't be seen again. The election of the table to the position of family heirloom is left in question by the poet's use of the anonymous someone. Someone was the protagonist of the table's migratory journey, but whether this someone is a relative of the table's current owner remains unclear. Using the word someone also has the effect of shifting the focus away from the table's owners, past and present, onto the object itself. We learn that the table, inured to use, no longer speaks. The human someone is backgrounded, and the table itself takes on a kind of subjectivity. There is a willfulness ascribed to it. It no longer speaks, which of course implies that it once did so. The line can be read metaphorically as well, to mean the table is no longer valued by its current owner, in the sense of the commonplace phrase used when pronouncing aesthetic judgments, "It says nothing to me." Line 4, however, changes the silence of the table from a human perception to an object reaction. The table is inured to use. The word choice inured, to grow accustomed, especially to something negative, elicits our sympathy for it. The table's raison d'être, to be useful, has faded. And isn't it often the case that while the use value of new objects delights, that of old is taken for granted? The table, reduced from a spoil to a used thing, has been silenced. Since the table is at a loss for words, the poem must shift perspective. And this is the next two stanzas. Having crawled beneath to disconnect the phone, I constellate wormholes in deal. The unusual circumstance of moving, the poem is called Packing Up, has changed the human-table relationship. Suddenly, the human has dropped down beneath the table to disconnect the phone and is observing it from an atypical perspective, more that of a child, though the sentiments that follow are hardly childlike. To find in this cramped space the cosmos evocative verb constellate, to group, surprises us more than the grubby, laborious wormhole. And yet together they make a world, turning the tea table into a register of the micro and macro universe both. Deal is the wood, that's a kind of wood, and with it we are moved back from the imaginative fancies of the speaker to the POC materiality of the object. This table, though once a spoil, has been eaten away with time. This image turns emblem and map of the fragility of human passions. The constellated wormholes become, back to the poem, black stars to guide us through whatever things we fought about hooded forms of rage and grief. So I'll read the part I just talked about and that next part so you can hear the way it flows down. Having crawled beneath to disconnect the phone, I constellate wormholes in deal, black stars to guide us through whatever things we fought about, hooded forms of rage and grief. Now we know that the speaker's sympathy with the table was born of his exile from the other human in the room, the lover who, in the wake of an argument, has become as silent as the furniture. By choosing the word things, whatever things we fought about, the poet inserts the possibility that the intrahuman alienation might have resulted from an argument over a material object, perhaps even this pocked Irish tea table, which one wanted to keep, the other to discard. With the lines, hooded forms of rage and grief, this possibility takes a metaphorical turn, implying that rage over things is standing in for a more substantial network of complex emotions the couple cannot face. The table protects the silence and reflects the tension. It acts the partner in the speaker's exile from the human world. He is, after all, down on his hands and knees under the table. He has lost his access to human comforts and looks to the table for guidance. The table translates the signs. From slipper foot to sea scroll, traffic of a dead world is testing a technique by which to make intentions clear. The slipper foot, more silence, connects to an ornamental design on the tea table's wood, a sea scroll, which is like a fancy ornament in wood. Okay, there must be one in this room. The traffic of the dead world brings us back to the immigrant scenario evoked at the opening of the poem. And then the final turn. Can this object, a vestige of the dead world, still record the intentions of the living? The poet's answer is definitive. You walk, and on the tabletop, a glass of water trembles. So that's the end of that little selection of those. I wanted to read this other chapbook that I wrote in 2006 for several reasons. One, because it's like a statement on poetics, and I haven't written that many of those, if any. And also because I made it at a very important time in my thinking about my life in poetry, it was a moment in which I was sort of like many of my contemporaries, people who kind of came up with me in poetry, were starting to what I would call fly up. That's what we used to say in Bluebirds when you became a campfire girl, which is that you would kind of fly up because you were a bluebird, you could fly, right? Meaning that they were starting to get better publishers to accept their work and to kind of get more recognition and win awards and grants and things. And I had this moment where I thought, I should do that. You know, I should become professionalized and try to push my work out there. And because frankly, I never send work out. I never send it out. I wait for someone to write me. And it's usually, you know, a student with a staple magazine or something. So I noticed, like in my last book, when you list the magazines that you're published in, I was like, no one's, these are all the names. You know, they were just hilarious. I was like, but anyway, I had this question. I was like, should I do this? You know, am I committing professional suicide? And it's just not something I ever really like to think about. So, and also that feeling of being left behind, you know, kind of like all your friends are getting to be better than you. And then you start feeling that they won't even talk to you at the next conference or whatever. But then, so I had to make this decision. And I decided to not do that, And it was not like I want to hide under a rock or anything like that. I know if somebody calls and says you won something, I'd be, yeah, you know, I'd be happy. I'm just not going to pursue it and put energy into it. And so what I realized is that I would refocus my energy back onto the poem and to the question of the poem and what it was and my art. And I partly marked this decision by making this little chapbook, which was inspired by the French poet Emmanuel Hocard's idea of the blaireau. Do you folks know Hocard at all? Have you heard of him a little bit? Anyway, he has this funny idea, a thing he calls a blaireau, which just means badger in French, so the badger, which is this idea of a thing that you do that no one that the value of is not immediately recognizable to anyone who sees you doing it, and that doesn't really work in any economy that you can point to. He compares it to the bricoleur, which I can't think of what the English word is for that, like the person who,
Handyman?
yeah, kind of like a handyman, who, but not a professional, really.
Odd jobs.
More odd jobs, like where, like, if you're redoing your living room, like fixing the holes in the wall and painting it, people can see that there's a value to that, and it's a meaningful activity. And he's saying the badger is, you can't see the value. And he has this image of, the reason why he calls it a badger is because those kind of brushes that men use when they shave, used to, I guess, are made of badger hair, and he has this image of cutting all the hairs off the brush and then pasting them back one by one as this kind of activity.
So it's kind of like academic work.
But the idea behind the badger is also that it has a certain amount of anonymity to it, and it has a gesture of privacy. It's not a public thing, and it's something that can be addressed to a friend, like a friend would understand. You know, they would see it, but the public wouldn't. And so he often will make little teeny books that he gives out to people, but he won't necessarily sign them. You know, or, you know, it's this kind of gesture, very ephemeral, small, strange, and hard to see the value of, which, you know, poetry. And so I made this little chapbook. I made like 26 copies and sent it to some friends. And then I made like 20 more. And I hadn't like made my own little chapbook since graduate school, so it was kind of fun just to go back to that little dorky, you know, stapling moment and remember how kind of great it is. But also, how could, you know, I'm just amazed at how much work it is too. Anyway, so this was a sort of attempt to think about my poetics, or poetics in general. So this is my blaireau, this is my badger. And I'm just going to read through it, and then hopefully we can discuss things. It's called Fragments of a Broken Poetics, and it has an epigraph from Jean Grosjean, who's a French poet, and it's, "Smile, if only from politeness, at the one moment of the world that concerns you." 1. The poet's psychology, visible only to the poet's friends, floats lightly over the surface of the poem. It discolors some words temporarily, but never quite settles into them, provided those words belong together. If so, they will eventually cast off this shadow. If not, it will eventually smother them. Thus it is the poem, not the poet, that we love. Though it is the singular, through it the singular becomes shared, the transitory eternal. 2. The eternal, typically a conceit standing in for the hope of civilizations, acts differently in poetry. For the words of the poem, once happily configured, may wait a very long time for a reader to read them as they were meant to be read. This is the eternity of the poem. 3. A poet needs only one poem, a poem only one reader. Moving from singular to shared in this instance is a rudimentary economy. It is less affecting than a mortal kiss, more than a passing conversation. The poem will always provoke an acute desire to know its creator, acute because hopeless. 4. Disembodied, the poem provokes longing. Its incorporeity is inscribed in myth, the severed head of Orpheus adrift on the Aegean Sea. Though separated, the head continues to sing. The song it sings is either a lament of exile from the body or a celebration of freedom from its material prison, depending on the direction of the winds. 5. The poet's emotional signature is retained in the poem. Aristotle, in his bipartite model of the soul, places the emotions under the obedient, illogical part, reason with command and logic, yet both parts are cognitive and partake in the logos. Thought is the efficient cause of emotion. This is why the poem's intelligence is more moving than its heart. 6. Just as ideas do not precede words, content is inchoate before form, and experience is inchoate before memory. This Proustian maxim holds true for the poem. Like us, words are ever-changing relics fighting for continued relevance. The poet's job is to preserve this fossil language, Emerson. In exchange, the poem returns the illusion of presence, the gift of the now. Poetic form is the temporal conduit between the past, present, and future. It organizes the senses so that they do not hinder the intellect in its lonely quest toward understanding, and in some cases, unity with something greater than itself. 7. What does it matter if there are poets or poems? 8. The idea of audience is a nuisance born of the need for spectacle. Poems haunting the precarious dialectic between existence and extinction do not need it. Their magic is dependent on the private experience of separate individuals. 9. Poets whose readings lead us to believe ourselves part of a spontaneous and instinctive consensus have left poetry behind, perhaps for the better. 10. The poet who foregrounds the surface qualities of the word, sound, texture, look, must be especially scrupulous when building the poem's semantic foundation. Effect should enhance complexity, not replace it. Otherwise, they risk giving complexity, which already struggles to justify itself, a very bad name. 11. In poetry, as elsewhere, nature isn't what it used to be. 12. The poem resists. It resists coming into being. It resists eloquence. It resists transmitting unpleasant or embarrassing knowledge. It resists grammatical constraints. It resists moving away from simple utterance. It resists revision. It resists completion. It resists success. Hopefully, the poet resists as well. 13. The book is the means, not the end. It should conform to the poem, not vice versa. Otherwise, the imagination becomes a small box which thinks only of the larger box it wishes to resemble. An ideal book is a bed, a comforting place in which poems can sleep while awaiting illumination. Both poem and book, however, are subject to the capricious lens of human attention. 14. The poem is responsible for the knowledge it proposes. It cannot account for what the reader does not know, nor should it account for what the reader desires. Any attempt to do so panders to a temporary and insufficient knowledge. The poem is not prophetic. It cannot foresee its relevance to others, and yet it still wants to be loved. 15. The poet must understand seduction, because even capricious human attention is susceptible to courtship. 16. Poetry, in the abstract, offends no one. 17. Isn't it sad that everyone laughs?
That should be your epitaph.
Stop. That would not be in the abstract.
That's right.
17. Sleep, to whom Keats partly owes his worthy rhymes, has long been kin to poetry. Saint Paul ruse affixing the sign that reads "Poet at Work" to his bedchamber is the most playful example of this alliance. Both sleep and poetry open a passage to the unconscious, one by nature, the other by artifice. Both create memories of astonishing wakefulness, one through dream, the other through imagination. It is almost impossible to reproduce or transmit such experiences by other means. 18. There are two kinds of poetic seduction. One is quick, content-based, and will tolerate no argument. The other is slow, formal, and easily deniable. The first may create wistful memories, but never a lasting relationship. The second, if successful, will become a part of you, a quiet attendant for life. 19. A momentary bewilderment arouses the mind. Many words, lines, and phrases may temporarily baffle without spoiling the reading experience as a whole. 20. Though it is true that before creation every quantum of content has infinite potential form, the successful poem will pass convincingly for the sole formal option, effectively erasing the memory of all other solutions. 21. A word can be a seed from which an entire poem grows, or it can be an integral part of a well-balanced formal arrangement, one leaf among many. Some words may act like birds and add a touch of color. but should they chance to fly away, the perception of the whole would not be altered. 22. Risks to the poet's life. Drowning from self-love, like Narcissus, or becoming infatuated with death, like Orpheus in Cocteau's retelling of the myth. Through the mirror lies the abyss in both cases, and thus it is impossible to tell them apart. 23. The poet is buried in the obliterated whiteness beneath the dark letters of the poem. 24. The poem helps us to understand the mystery of the world, or excuse me, of the word. The poem helps us, as a Freudian
Is that
slip.
what it says there? Or is
It says word. It
Okay.
says word, yeah. Who wrote this anyway? The poem helps us to understand the mystery of the word. In the process, the obvious becomes meaningless, the enigmatic revelatory. Sometimes the poem has more friends than the poet.
Sometimes.
26. Publication, popularity, and prizes. All three are unreliable measures of value. In fact, any indicator of poetic worth that is immediately perceptible to people who care nothing for poetry is likely to be, in some part, false. 27. There is a time in every poet's life when the mention of other writers, even if dead, is intolerable. It is a necessary rejection of the known text in favor of the not yet written. If things go as they should, this allergy will be only temporary. The lively mind will eventually find such closed antipathy boring and opt for openness instead. 28. Poems demand a concentrated lingering to which we are unaccustomed. This is why they cause discomfort. When we stand still in one place, attempting to document and respect the details, we feel as vulnerable as a small creature in an open field beneath avian predators. Rapid and sequential page turning gives us a sense of progress and accomplishment, relieving us from the double threat of frustration and impatience. 29. Language has no weather, and therefore is not, strictly speaking, an environment. 30. Poets who have learned a lesson write poems that teach. 31. The Hermetic poem is premised on a deep-held respect for an invisible knowledge already assumed to exist. It wishes to be like Hermes in Botticelli's Printemps, shooing away the little clouds. Moving clouds with a wand, however, is a very delicate business. The poet who attempts it lightly risks becoming lost in a mist. 32. Inspiration is a matter of will, imagination of mind. The former comes from forces outside the poet, whether they be divine or mundane, issuing from the muse or the polis. Dull, meaningless environments dry up this faculty and put too much pressure on the imagination, which arises from inside the poet and can, if left without outlet, collapse. 33. A collapsed imagination results in acute neurosis. And yet, while all neurotics are imaginative, many poets are not. 34. I once wrote, "Those who think poetry is working are laboring under a misconception," by which I meant that the mental activity of writing a poem sabotages the mechanized reproduction of culturally programmed cognition. Workaday thought is put to a stop. 35. Poetry is play for very high stakes, which, though the cause of an extremely competitive race, can never be collected. 36. Poets, once they reach a certain maturity, may begin to repeat themselves. This realization can stultify, and for a time silence. But there is no shame in refining a well-constructed and meaningful design. Subtlety has authored many a shakedown. The established poet, who, fearing calcification, reverts to a quest for novelty, not only robs the youth of their one advantage, but risks looking the fool as well. 37. The trick with fashion is to sit it out. 38, and this has an epigraph from Cary Grant. in that movie To Catch a Thief, that Hitchcock movie. Do you guys know that one? This is him. His character says this: I have the same interest in jewelry as politics, modern poetry, or women who need weird excitement. None. You can learn a great deal about what people think of you by paying attention to the company they place you in. 39. The living language is intimately connected to poetic form. When Middle English went, so did bob and wheel. And yet, since in addition to floating on the air, poems now live in books, archaic words and forms can be revived, and if sparingly applied, provide a certain charm to an otherwise speech-based composition. As with Shakespeare's language, which is spoken nowhere but on the stage, we suspend our disbelief out of love for the fresh turns of phrase, outre diction, and elegant artifice. In this time of plain speaking, some may also find that a moment away from natural speech can come as a great relief. 40. I have met very few poets who are calm about or accepting of the way visual artists use language in their work. 41. After a point, even the poem can grow bored with its own devices. 42. It seems as if the able use of metaphor has precipitously fallen off since doubt was cast upon language's ability to represent the real. And yet simile, a far less interesting trope, somehow continues to thrive. 43. Poetry is not politically efficacious in countries where it is not valued as a cultural necessity by the general populace. 44. The poem occupies an invisible zone between the subjective emotional utterance and the objective reporting of fact. It is relative and universal, false and true. Negotiating this contradiction with finesse is crucial to the poem's success. 45. A great deal of overlap notwithstanding, the poem's knowledge is never quite identical to the poet's. Poets understand the intention behind their poems and may even recognize the outcome, but there is always a remainder they cannot foresee and indeed may never detect. 46. The poem's life is not coeval with the poet's. 47. The novice poet uses the poem in the service of desire, while the expert presses desire into the service of the poem. 48. Poetry can imitate the existence of forces beyond, Poetry can intimate the existence of forces beyond the understanding of the individual mind. And yet, as a strictly human endeavor, reliant on the individual, it is a poor substitute for religion. Sorry, Wally. I said, sorry, Will, the little note. Sorry, Wallace Stevens. The fiction it provides can neither be standardized nor significantly shape behavior. In addition, belief has nothing whatsoever to do with the existence of poetry. Still, we might ask, in the absence of God, is poetry the best vehicle through which to address metaphysical questions? No, it is one way among many, and has never, regardless of the relative state of God and religion, shied away from questions of the soul. 49. It is easier to eavesdrop on and denigrate the compassionate, learned, and much interrupted conversation that makes up the history of poetry than it is to participate in it. 50. The most mysterious thing about poetry is that poets, even when lacking any prospect of reward or recognition, continue to find it satisfying to write. So that's that. 50.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I was struck by what I thought was an interesting discrepancy between the phrase, there are things we live among, and to know them is to know ourselves.
To see them is to know ourselves.
See them and to know is to know ourselves. And the beginning of the essay, which cites Bowen, in which you say that, I'm paraphrasing now, you're going to correct me. She understood how difficult it is to have empathy for the object world.
Her characters in her novels, yeah.
And I guess what I'm wondering is, should we have empathy for the object world? Is the object world supposed to be the recipient of empathy? It seems like Oppen gets around that by suggesting that the object world is a means to our self-knowledge, and that a properly critical stance towards the object world reveals things that we want to know, and that, in fact, we are. And I'm just wondering whether you interpret that as empathy.
In Oppen?
Yeah.
No, no. I think Oppen is coming more from an idea of that relationship to the object world that has a more Marxist base, which is the question of labor and that relationship to it. And you know, in these essays, I'm not trying to take a position, but to sort of explore all different positions. And do you know Elizabeth Bowen's novels?
Not at all.
Oh, okay. She has, in this novel, The House in Paris, which I write about, she has a moment where a character is just jilted by a lover and starts having this sense that the only solace she finds is in sort of these objects that she kind of is around. And so she really sort of animates the material world in that text in a way that's very vivid. So I think they're distinct. I think you picked up on that. And in the book, I'm not making an argument. I'm trying to look at different things.
Do you find one of
the only argument I'm making is that the material world is worth thinking about. And it's not just as simple to say that, you know, there's this bumper sticker that you might have seen that's the best things in life aren't things. You know, this one way of looking at the world, the object world or the material world that we have is that it's the idea of crass consumerism, or the sense that it's only this empty, meaningless gesture of acquiring meaningless objects. And there is that, right? That is something that does occur. And so I kind of wanted to sort of say, I don't believe that, first of all, and I think that our relationship to objects is more complicated, but so that's sort of, I don't want to go on beyond that. But
are you tempted by one of those options more than the other in your own work, or would you say that you are productively of two minds about it?
No, I feel empathy for objects.
You do.
I experience them as living. Not every object.
It might be overwhelming.
I know, you wouldn't be able to live in the world. But I'm interested the way that objects take on value based on the relationship they have to certain humans. And also, like, I do have a chapter where I talk about those cases in thrift stores that have, like, the jewelry, where you go and you see, and some of it's it looks cheap and tawdry or whatever, and then sometimes it's very personal items like cameos or little lockets and things. And I'm interested the way things become devalued when they're out of a relationship to their owners, and that whole sort of question. So, but I do feel that my relationship with the material world is a sensuous, empathetic one, and it isn't just something, I'm not trying to get over it, you know. It's something that I feel that is important to me.
Well, something if I could just say something real quick. Something that I can't, an association that I've always regretted about Oppen's poem since seeing this movie is that now whenever I read it, I think of Castaway with Tom Hanks. Have you seen this movie?
No. But I don't think I would think of Oppen's poem if I had.
I don't want to either, it's involuntary. But
because of the shipwreck of the thing?
It's not a good movie, but there is a heartbreaking moment when the soccer ball that Tom Hanks has named and has become his only friend over the course of 4 years on the island floats off when he's up from the raft and he can't find it, and he's screaming, I'm sorry at the soccer ball. And it strikes me that there's a great relationship between an empathy for the material world and our sense of ourselves as either solitary or social creatures. You know, I mean, the people who have the most empathetic relationship to objects are children.
Oh.
And if you take their blanket, I mean, they can, you know, not that I do this.
When I take their blanket, I've observed.
But you know, he says, Crusoe, we say, was rescued, so we have chosen
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
That's the choice.
He seems to be kind of opting for Crusoe
Right.
in a very fascinating way.
Which is interesting because, I mean, as a Marxist, he recognizes the need for the social and the way that the social world constructs us, right? And the way that our relationship to objects constructs us. But he has a great sympathy with Crusoe's position as someone who is completely abstracted from the social, and is able, therefore, to almost be free and create in a different way.
But he also, Crusoe, becomes very attached to his objects, like Tom Hanks
Right.
in the movie, which I now must see.
It's not a great movie.
But that soccer ball scene, the way it sounds great. But his relationship to his objects is removed from commerce at that point.
Exactly.
And so suddenly he finds this relationship to the use of things again. And I feel maybe that's the utopian, nostalgic project that Oppin's poem is somewhat engaged in, perhaps.
Oh, because now everything is no longer part of the fetishism.
Right, it's removed from commodity capitalism, and so commodity culture is not a fetish anymore, it becomes this other thing. Arguably, it takes on a different kind of like primitive fetishistic quality because the things become almost magical, you know, so in that sense. Any other questions? Or comments?
A little bit on the chapbook itself. After constructing that, do you find yourself returning to it and often wanting to add to it, or re-examining the ways in which you put some ideas together at that moment and changing them?
There's one line in the whole book that I don't agree with. one phrase that when I was reading it, because I hadn't looked at it for a while, since it's a couple years old, 3 years old, I was like, I still believe everything I'm saying here. I still feel connected to these convictions, except for this one line, which I won't tell you what it is.
No. You have to tell us.
Well, you can just tell us the number.
But I have thought, when I finished it a long time ago, I thought, well, maybe I'll do 50 more, you know, because I felt like it could go on. But then it didn't, and it might, you know, I might do another, if I get that moment where I'm ready and I have the time and all my other projects are closed down, I might do more. So, but it does have that sense of, once you do a series, you know, it's dangerous. There's people, 8,000th one, you know, it's kind of, but you know, it's sort of, my goal was 50, and then I thought, well, if I get inspired again, I'll do it, so. Yeah?
This is I think, an odd question, just something that struck me, and I was wondering if you could just comment on your use of, first it seemed you were preoccupied with the kind of a prepositional possessive of made out of, for example, and I just, and it was, you use out of, and it felt like this sort of, you know, inside-outside relationship, rather than, you know, possessive, which you then moved on to using of much more often, and until finally we did get to some personal pronouns that were your, my, etc. And I'm wondering why the movement between those particular ways of relating to the material, those particular types of constructions.
Do you mean within the one essay or throughout the whole, the separate ones?
The sort of 5 essays you, especially, I mean, the personal pronouns came in the essay about, the final essay about furniture, I think, when you were quoting, and it's your bed, my, this.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what you're asking. So I'll try an answer, and you can tell me if it's at all.
I mean, I feel like it's a question of, I wonder if it's a question of translation, because of Romance constructions being the possessive is often, you know, de or de, and that you were using those constructions rather than, you know, saying, I don't know, Pat's house. It was the house of Pat.
Oh, I see. I see.
But I mean, I don't think that's the most sophisticated explanation. I just.
Well, maybe so. And I mean, what you're describing, I'm not even sure a conscious choice was involved. But I would say that this book has been written at various times and it has an inconsistency. And I wanted that, actually. But as far as what you're asking, I don't really know what to say, other than it wasn't like a conscious decision on my part. Yeah, the only reason I was thinking about "of" in the opposite piece was obviously because it's a crucial word. But you say later on, I say things like the house of Frank and things like that.
Well, that was a bad example, but it's just it seems.
You're talking about like in my writing. Oh, okay.
In favor of using "of," where in
No, I don't. I think that might have been a quirk or something, and it might not be consistent. No, it's not a conscious choice.
Thought of like
No, I'm all for the possessive vibe. Yeah, yeah. No, I didn't shy from the possessive out of any. No.
Okay.
But that was very astute. Now I'm going to go back and read what is it. Change it all to possessive. Yeah.
Was Jed and Jennifer
At the same time?
Go to the Jennifer and then the truncated.
Go ahead, Jed.
I was struck when you were introducing the essays on things, you talked about the dossiers, and you said that you literally had folders on your desktop, and I didn't know if you meant
If she meant the computer,
file folders on a physical desktop or
I wondered that too.
computer folders on the computer desktop. And that got me thinking about the way we think of things that aren't really things, right? Like the desktop.
They're metaphors that we use.
And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on times when non-objects take on a status as objects, and sort of how do we relate to them in the same way as tangible, perceptual things? And this can be metaphorical objects or conceptual objects.
I think that, you mean like ideas?
Yeah.
Or poems.
I mean, because I think the folder on my desk, my computer, is an object in a way, right? It does exist, even though they say virtual. It actually does exist. I don't know. I think that I don't think so. I think that, can you have an infection for an idea? Yes, absolutely, you can. But in some ways, I feel like non-material things are not possessed. Like you can't own them.
What about children and like imaginary friends and stuff? I mean, they're real, right? In a sense.
Especially after they lose their blankets.
This is why I know so much about them. I was like, you've got imaginary friends going. I'm sorry.
No. I think that things that we can't see and that we believe in. I mean, what about God? I mean, there's one, right?
What if God was one of us?
So awful. All right.
A duo.
So one can feel things.
Jennifer's a street man.
I know. I'm always the gullible one. I'm not answering your question very well, but I was thinking that, like, with things that don't exist, that are ideas, that don't exist as tangible, I don't feel that you can possess them in the same way. You know, there's that way where, especially in academia and in poetry too, well, that was my idea. You know, I thought of that. Damn it. You know, I remember I had a friend who believed that he invented the idea that you would write a poem from the dictionary. This is impossible, right? But he wanted to patent that idea. He was like, this was my idea. I thought of it, and he could like tell you the day and everything, and of course, so he has this little chip on his shoulder. But I don't feel that that's sort of what I've thought about in this book at all. I did have, you know, there was an earlier version of Microsoft Word that had this little man. Mm-hmm. I did grow kind of strangely attached to that little man, but he did actually exist. Like if he made a frown at me, I was very upset. You know, I got very attached to him, so I'm so glad he's not in the new version. It's kind of, but he exists. He exists. Imaginary friends. I don't know.
Hold on.
Jen had a question.
Michael, I get to ask my question. You can also inject, whatever you like.
Go ahead.
It's like the Edith Archie, but I'm in the Archie chair. Right?
You're Archie.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I'm not sure that I have all the pieces of the question lined up yet, but it goes something like this. As you were reading yesterday and today, I couldn't, this is normal, I couldn't help but think of the talk that you gave with Steve at my house years ago that was erupted by Stephen Revere, as I remember, which was about audience and the question of audience. Who are we writing for? Who are we talking to? And it seems that in your work there is a deeper and deeper distrust of sort of communal formations, and this Poetics statement is partially growing out of maybe the dissolution of a kind of community formation. And so I guess I'm wondering about audience, because your work is actually full of argument and full of injunction and full of you know, a kind of rage that leads toward action. And yet there isn't at all the sense that there's an immediate receptacle for this injunction or an immediate interlocutor for the argument, even when it's being written in a sort of epistolary form. And there, you can even tell us that this was written for your friend in LA, the painter. And so in some way that makes the question of thinking so hard about objects interesting to me, because objects don't lend themselves to argument, and you say that you're not actually trying to make an argument in this Poetics essay stuff. So I guess I'm wondering about the place of argument in poetry as opposed to some kind of poetics, and who it's directed toward. And you know, this relates to a kind of problem of, you know, your work is very modernist in its matrix of citation, and yet you're kind of rejecting certain forms of consensus formation that the modernists were chasing after. And I've been thinking about this a lot because of all the schools that are rushing to form themselves. So anyway, I guess I'm wondering how your sense of who you're writing for has been changing, and how that inflects what you're writing about, and how, and how your poetry is evolving in relationship to these kinds of social formations and their dissolution.
We just asked a lot of questions. No, I mean, it's really interesting to hear you characterize my work, because I always learn something, you know. But I actually think of, I feel like this little book of Poetics is very much more in keeping with the tone of maybe my poems, in the sense that it is making arguments, and whereas the book of essays, I feel, is more fluid and a little less contentious, and like I said, I chose the few essays, those are the only ones I've done that directly address poems. Actually, they go off into way other art forms and realms. But I would say that when I was younger and first starting out in poetry, the idea of a community was just central, totally central to my sense of being in poetry. And I meant a community that was very local, connected, a friendship circle, coterie as they would call it, in a negative sense. And the sense that you share with your friends, and you share the same values, and you influence each other, and you collaborate, and the whole, you know, thing that sort of is assumed at this point.
And it seems really non-virtual, which was the other part of the question. That a lot of community formation now is done virtually, but your work seems to be very estranged from that kind of blogger's paradise of, you know, association.
Yeah, I don't. I have no virtual community. I'm not on Facebook. My partner is. He has a virtual community, and he's very comfortable in a virtual community. But I feel like I don't trust a virtual community. I don't feel, I want an interlocutor that I actually know, that I've like sat down and had food with. That's old-fashioned, perhaps, so that's the way I am. And I am a letter writer. I have correspondences. I'm an epistolary person, which is hard. So you get fewer and fewer friends because nobody will write you back. But I do have some, and I've gotten some people who swore they would never write letters to start correspondences with me. And so this is my evil plan to go back. No, because I feel like in letters, many are a place that many poets work out their poetics, you know, in a space that's private and that they trust the interlocutor, and that they can sort of think through the poem without having isolation, you know. And the letter is a strangely, you're supposedly talking to someone, but at the same time you can just indulge yourself. So it's a strange, you know. And I think you're right that increasingly, though I still refer to people who are supposedly in my community, some of the people who I would associate like the development of my work with, I'm not really friends with anymore. I'm not in touch with. It's not because of any violent break or anything. It's just busyness, life, you know, you move away. Academia disrupts communities, as you know, and lovers. But I also think of my community as the poets that I love, and they could be dead, you know, and speaking back to them. So that's also very nostalgic, I guess. But there was a point, I think, probably around 1998, when I decided that, when I didn't decide, but I realized that I was going off on my own, you know, in my thinking, and leading an increasingly solitary literary life, and not trying to project those communities anymore. But those were the values that I started out with very strongly, and partly because of coming into poetry right after language poetry and being influenced by those community formations and the kind of reconstruction of modernist community formations, which were they weren't healthy communities at all, but you idealize them, you know, when you're not in them. And then I kind of realized that many of the people I was interacting with didn't have those same values, actually, and were very much doing their own thing and thinking about their own career. And they might give lip service to community, but they really didn't care about it. So it's their fault. No, I just sort of drifted away in a way. And now I'm very isolated in terms of my actual community, you know, physically. But it's turned out that's okay. And
that influences your poetics. That's what I'm the most interested in. Like,
you mean how I write poems?
How much the poem is directed toward a kind of argument, and that the long form permits you to do that really at length, almost as if the poem itself is a kind of circulation of voices.
I think that's less about the actual, I think it's more about the kind of poetry I value. Yeah, like you said, modernism, but also New American poetry, in which many poets, Spicer, for example, their poetry is their poetics. You know, they're making arguments always about the art within the art. And in some way, something actually I've been trying to break away from a little bit, because when I was younger, I always wrote poems to try to get people to like me, you know, to sleep with me or whatever, like you do. You get up. No, nobody does this anymore. You know, and
I have a letter from the provost says I can't do that.
You know, it's your love song. You know, that's what I was trying to talk about. When you're young, you use the poem to in the service of your desire, whatever that desire may be, and it might be just seduce, you know, a poet you admire, and not like literally, but you know, intellectually. But now, I don't feel like I'm making an argument to a particular community, if that's what you mean. I have done that. I can point you to poems that are directly arguments to this community, but I would say that Oh, it'd be more general now, more general, I guess. But when I was younger, I have this journal entry where I say, you know, don't write any more poems about love. You know, I was like, stop it. I had to consciously, and then now I feel like it'd be, don't write any more poems about poetry. This is enough already, you know, talk about something else. And I don't think that, hopefully I don't think that the arguments in my poems are all about poetry. I think they might also, right, I would think a lot of them would be just about, you know, how to live a meaningful life. And my life, part of the meaning of my life happens to do with poetry, so that comes into it. Does that make sense? But I still like the kind of, also community has changed for me in that like some younger poets, or not so young poets, who have read my work and come to me through the work, which was totally different than somebody who you meet and you don't know each other's work, you like each other, and then you grow to like each other, and then you support each other. Or if someone comes to you through the work and then they have to discover that you aren't the work, and then you can maybe build a friendship based on that. So that's also been a really lovely development, actually. You know, when the work actually makes you a new friend, you know, or enemy, as the case may be. I don't know that I answered your question very well, but it's a smart reading of the poems.
We could do John and then you.
I wanted to ask you to say a bit more about the notion of resistance, specifically the kind of resistance that you attribute to poetry, and which also seems to inhere in your idea of the poetic remainder. That is, there seems to be a kind of lapidary resistance that kind of endures throughout whatever, how poetry is taken up in various situations. Does that kind of resistance share anything with the kind of resistance that seems to be possessed of the object world? That is one of the things that seems to prevent objects from crossing over and becoming something beyond objects, but staying in the object world as things, is that there's, well, like the basic notion of just like physical resistance. But objects also seem to possess a kind of intractability that keeps us from endowing them with qualities beyond the object world. So I guess the basic question is there any kind of commonalities between poetic resistance and object resistance?
What do you mean by poetic resistance?
Well, in your last piece, you described
the whole idea of the poem resistance. Yeah. Okay. That would. Yeah. Well, if you believe that language is an object, is a material thing, which I used to, then you could say very directly that it resists in that sense, that it has a life outside of you, which it does, obviously, and that it resists in that sense. But I think that language is not an object, actually. So I wouldn't.
But is the poem an object?
Yeah. Once it's written, I suppose. But it is and it isn't, you know, because it's made out of language. So that's a complicated question. You know, it does exist, but it's the print and the paper are an object, but the poem is not just those things, cannot be just reduced to those things, right? So
you could destroy all the copies of a poem and it could still exist if someone has memorized it.
Exactly, yeah. So, I don't know, back in the day I used to think a lot about the materiality of language and blah, 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 but now I don't use that terms anymore. I think it's so eloquent the way everybody weaves the two projects together, and I have trouble doing that myself. But I'm not answering your question, but I don't think so. I don't think I think of it as a connection. Because the poem, again, it's not a thing that can be owned in that way. It cannot be, it's not material in that way. Does that make sense? I'm not satisfied.
Bob has a question.
I wanted to ask you to reflect on the difference between what was available to Oppen and what's available to you in terms of attitudes toward made things, because I remember, Williams and Oppen and Charles Tomlinson, and these were poets who thought that care for material objects was a kind of ethical value, and that one could learn to focus one's attention by taking objects more seriously than one often does take them more casually, and so on. And like thinking also of Zhukovsky's A9, where he's drawing off of Capital, and Marx says if objects could speak, if things could speak, this is what they say, and what they would say is that value, surplus value, is extracted from the workers, and there's a sense in which my relationship to objects, first of all, it's changed in my lifetime, but because during my lifetime, the U.S. has become less of a manufacturing center. And so that the made in the USA, which when I was a kid was a really common thing to see. And it's not so common now. And the objects that I'm wearing, I suspect, if I looked at the labels, when I do, I see they're not made in the USA. And when you buy these chairs and so forth, they're not made in the USA. And so there's a kind of distance between, it's an epistemological difference, I think, for citizens, is that we don't really know the conditions of production. And we don't even really know the places of production often, but they come with these little labels. We know that most of the objects that we buy are not made in conditions that we understand. So that what those labels say when it says made in Malaysia or made in Sri Lanka or something, it means that the conditions in which we receive objects and we purchase objects requires mobility of capital. And so I wonder if the lesson that Marx took from objects, the lessons that Oppen, who would make furniture, was interested in craft and the making. In other words, he was interested in domestic production, in working with objects right in front of you in this studio. And our relationship to objects is now entirely different because we live in an economic empire more than they did when they formed their ideas 50, 60, 70 years ago. And whereas, in other words, what I'm saying is I think that when I take objects seriously, the objects in this room, if these things could speak, what would they say? It's not the lesson of Capital that would be most of interest to me. The lesson that would be most of interest to me is that the newer objects are made elsewhere and are in conditions that I have to be blind to because of the distance, but that my life entails an investment in everything that it takes to protect the mobility of capital. And I mean, that's a lesson, and that's taking objects seriously, but I can't be as appreciative as Oppen could be of these objects unless I'm quite comfortable with this blindness, and I'm not comfortable with it. And I could limit my consumption, say, to just domestic production and conditions of production that I might actually have a chance of knowing. That is, don't buy from sweatshops, and so forth. But that's hard. There are a lot of things you can't buy, like an automobile. So So I guess what I'm saying is that when you said you backed off from the critique of materialism, of crass, kind of that you said you thought it was more complicated. I agree that it's more complicated, but I wonder if you agree with me that what Oppen could think of objects and what you should think of objects has to be different.
I think that, I agree with you in the sense that the world has changed. At the same time, I would say, even before the modernist period, even, for example, with the pre-Raphaelites and their relationship to going back pre-industry, to try to reconnect the sense of origin, and that you could actually connect to the material world in some meaningful way if you could just get back to the making. I think that ever since industrial capitalism has started, reared up its engines, that has been an alienation. And when you say, well, I can't connect to the chair because I don't understand the conditions of its making, I would say, well, that's the point. That of course you can't. The chair alienates you. At the same time, I believe that because I am subject to nostalgia and the sense that, like a wooden object, that you could, like the surrealists thought that you could see, the human labor enclosed in that, and that it could be released in this kind of revolutionary way and create potential. But I feel that's a very, it's a nostalgic desire, and I don't see why a plastic object couldn't do that as well. But we sense that if we could touch and connect to and understand not just the production and the labor that went into it and the conditions under which it was produced, but the material, the actual material. A lot of things I don't know what they're made out of. I actually clothes that I don't know what they're weird things, right? Lydia Davis has this great moment in this story where she's sort of talking about little notes to how she's going to change her life, and one is like, I will only wear cotton and natural fabrics. This kind of like longing for that past. But I would say that I'm on the same trajectory as the pre-Raphaelites, as the modernists. I'm in that same logic. It's just expanded, and I wouldn't believe the argument, maybe with Oppen, but I wouldn't believe the argument that those artists, those poets, were necessarily any more directly in tune with those laborers who produce the objects that it's different if you make your own object, like you said in the case of Oppen, but that alienation was still already there. And even if it's made in the US, it's different. It's still not, I don't feel that that's necessarily closer to me. Maybe what's different is that the world, it's not just that the objects are made farther away, but that the world is smaller, so it isn't farther away, right? So that we have it doesn't feel so far away anymore. What's the difference anymore? So I totally agree with you. The conditions are different, and there is a nostalgic thread through my work. Obviously, not obviously, but I admit to that. And it's also a nostalgia for that kind of moment where the object could speak back the human labor to you. But I also think that I'm interested in the way in which one can attach all kinds of meaning to an object in which you have no knowledge of the origin and you have no relationship to the way it was made. And it takes on this other meaning, and the sense that the maker is probably completely alienated from it, which is also one of these gifts of this system that we're in. So the maker is, maybe putting it through a production line, and then it goes and it becomes this magical object somewhere else. I think that's totally fascinating. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I do think what you describe as a change is accurate, but that I see it as a continuation, a continuum, and that the system as such still operates under a very similar logic in terms of that, that labor is not the measure of value.
So I agree with you about it being a more continual process, but there are some stages, and one stage that the reason why domestic production matters to me is that I do have some sense of of the regulatory controls of the conditions of production when it says made in the USA. I'm not saying everything's peachy for workers on domestic soil, but that's different. There are institutions I participate in some way, which control sweatshops in this political unit of the nation, whereas what goes on in China and what we know of what goes on in China, for example, is really kind of loathsome. And I don't really know it. I can't know anything about the can't take any responsibility really for the regulatory agencies in China or Sri Lanka or Malaysia or any place else. So that's a kind of, I just mean to say that's a kind of level of political responsibility that I can say.
Right.
It matters to me, even though there are industrial processes that are far removed from individual craftsmen.
Yeah, yeah. I guess my position is that I cannot live ethically under such, like by making decisions on to buy this or that in this system. You know, I can feel better about myself, but it's not actually anything beyond that. Does that make sense? I mean, it sounds awful, I guess, but a consciousness, but to sort of say, well, therefore I won't have to think about it. I mean, I guess one of the things that's interesting to me about is the way in which we think about what our relationship to the object world. It doesn't necessarily have to be just what you buy now. It could be something that you have, you know, that's 200 years old family thing. So I think that I keep thinking of the food thing, you know, how people who buy local and they want to know the origin of their food. And partly there's a politics of caring about animals or caring about conditions of the workers, but partly there's a kind of anxiety about your own body and the sense that you want to know that it's safe what you're eating. And I would sort of say that seems to me where a lot of that is located in the US anyway, is this anxiety about origins based on distrust of other places.
Yes.
So
anxiety and guilt, right? Because you can have a guilt-free life too.
Right, right.
I'm not anxious about my health, and I'm not guilty about and that makes me healthier and happier. By the way, I have no idea about the broader consequences of these things.
Can I have some water, please? So I don't know. That's such an interesting question, and it's completely important, you know, I think. Are we running out of time? Oh.
I just wanted to return to something Jennifer was asking about the idea of community, and I just taught Clamp Down in my undergrad poetry workshop, and the students were really struck by how much the first person singular kind of is spoken through in the book. We feel this, we do that, you know, and that kind of imagined community that the we entails seems like it's a little bit runs against the grain of what, in an interesting way, with what you're saying about feeling increasingly solitary as a writer now than when you began in a kind of community building kind of way. And but my question, I guess, is about another thing that interested them about the book was what they perceived as a kind of conservatism of form. The use of rhyme, the kind of antiquarian tonal register that's used kind of deliberately, kind of almost a metaphysical kind of speaker. And I'm wondering if, in a way, Jen was asking about argument, the role of argument in your poetry. And it seemed like, in a way, the arguments within the poems were endlessly doubling back on themselves and doubting themselves and not actually putting forward a certain position in a way that I thought was very artful. But then on the level of form, it seemed like the use of older forms, you know, of what my students viewed as conservative forms by an avant-garde poet, was a kind of almost a polemical kind of formal. So on the level of form, the book struck people as being polemical by saying, I can use you know, rhyme in my book. And so I'm wondering if what you have to say about your changing attitude towards form, and if you feel like the use of traditional forms has some kind of argumentative value or use in your work.
In a we business.
Yeah.
Starting with. Yeah. I didn't know if that connected with you.
Well, first of all, I just want to loop back and say, like, I feel like I'm painting this picture of myself as all alone in my room in the attic or whatever. That's not the case. I am in dialogue with friends and a community. I'm just saying, when I sit down to write, I don't feel like there's 5 other people who are making the same poetic argument and we're going to go have our manifesto. And, you know, like, I feel like that's something that happens in your 20s. It's important. You draw a line in the sand. Nobody listens. And then you move on. So that's fine. But in terms of the we, I'm not sure when I use that. I mean, I probably use it in the occasion, but that's actually talking about a group of people. So there was a we. It'd be like we in this room. And sometimes I use we in the old sort of, you know, humanity. I remember I wrote an essay where I did that, and somebody just got so mad at me and said, you can't do that. It's not done. It's not, you can't speak for other people. And I said, well, you know, I can use this pronoun. But with the idea of, I don't think of myself as an avant-garde poet, first of all. I think that's a term that is thrown around and is not really, I don't think you can be an avant-garde poet alone, first of all. And I think of myself as just a poet. And I feel like the avant-garde, first of all, I would say is very conservative in the sense that it is deeply embedded in literary tradition. And if it didn't have literary tradition, there would be no avant-garde. So the sense that, so I feel those are not actually oppositional terms. And I think of, when I think of conservative in the sense of to conserve, to keep things, to not throw things out. You know, like Benedict Lifshitz says in his autobiography, The 1.5-Eyed Archer, about being part of the Russian futurists. You know, we all wanted to throw Pushkin off the ship of modernity, but we slept with a copy under our pillow. You know, it's sort of this, it's a gesture, right? You want to throw out tradition to make room for yourself, but you want to be part of it, ultimately. That's the goal. So I would say that, for me, the use of, there's only one poem in a traditional form in that book, but I might gesture toward archaic rhetorics. There are 3 poems that are in dialogue with John Donne.
The love poem.
Yeah, and I wanted to break music, and, you know, because John Clare talks about Donne as having a broken foot, and I was just fascinated in that, you know, the difficulty. So to me, it's just part of the possibility of poetry, and that I always tell my students, like, you should be able to try everything and do everything, and to sort of say, well, that's not interested anymore. To take, you know, everything that's out there and sort of rethink it for the moment. So I guess that's more my goal. But it does, I was talking to Michael about this, it does increasingly propose a literacy that doesn't exist, or that if everyone's reading me in relationship to across a contemporary landscape, they're going to miss a lot, because the work is in dialogue more with the past at this point, and the contemporary landscape to me is a given. But I feel increasingly like, where are you in the contemporary landscape? How can we position you? And I don't feel that that's a question that I'm particularly interested in at this point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I feel like those frames need to, I don't know, we need new terms for them. I guess he's written a whole book about that, right? So I don't know. But I also think that the idea that form, to me, also the avant-garde or poets that are trying to be progressive formally, it's always about form. It's always about how form affects meaning and how it affects the literary surface. And so that heritage led me to traditional form, you know, not the other way around. And I have that backward heritage, that backward history where I started, you know, with Kit Robinson and had to move toward John Donne because I had a horrible education, you know. And I feel like we still talk as though we're all educated in the British school system, when in fact it's just not the case, you know.
I think that's very common though these days.
What?
You know, I mean, I started with Neruda and
right, but often
a lot of people do that, and then you move back.
Yeah,
you know.
but often people talk as though, you know, you threw off the tradition.
Right.
And I'm like, what tradition? You know, there was no tradition.
Whereas actually throwing off tradition involves going back to the actual tradition and learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is
Some people actually, I did not start with Kit Robinson. It took me a long time.
No, that just really depends on where you went to school.
Yeah, more conservatively.
It really depends on where you go to school. I mean, so, or if you went to school.
Just a question, have you ever been influenced by T.S. Eliot? Is he part of your poetic background?
Oh yeah, I love Eliot. You know, I have a love-hate relationship
We
to
were
him.
talking about writing letters.
Mm-hmm.
And I came across a fascinating letter that Eliot wrote to a man named Norbert Wiener in 1915. Both of them were philosophy students at Harvard. Norbert Wiener went on to be a great philosopher and invented the word cybernetics, and much of what he wrote about has come true and is part of our daily life. I'm not sure if any of you know his name, but he's a great person. Eliot, I had read quite a bit of and worked on. I wasn't at all aware of the fact how deeply he was involved in philosophy and logic. And he very much was. I don't know whether
Yep.
you're aware of that or not.
Yep.
Fascinating how wide his variety of influences were. Not his on other people so much as what he took from others.
Yeah, yeah, yes. He's actually, but I also think his on others is a whole interesting study. But I think Eliot's fascinating. I resisted him for a long time because I'm very dedicated to Williams, and as you know, they're often put as on different sides. They didn't like each other. Well, Williams didn't like Eliot anyway, and but I realized.
Are you talking about William Carlos?
Yes, 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 yes. Who's very important to me. But then I realized you don't need to replicate the arguments of your fathers, which is actually stupid. So I could read Eliot, and I also came to a place where I appreciated his metaphysical questions and his relationship to God and his relationship to the tradition. At the same time, I understand why he drove Williams crazy at that time when Williams had this other project and felt that Eliot was sabotaging it. Which is borne out, by the way, the academia embraced Eliot after the war, I think. But I do think that Eliot is someone you have to face and confront, and I also think he's written some beautiful poems. So
He's fascinating because the more you read him, the more you understand.
But he also became like this model for difficulty that was only like this one model. And so, yeah. So I feel that kind of blocked all other models of difficulty in an interesting, complicated way. So is it late?
Should we have one last question? I thought I saw Stephanie. Ready?
Well, this is a very kind of simple question, but you had a formulation in your Poetics that I really was intrigued by and liked, and I'm going to butcher it, but it was something along the lines of, and this is kind of going back to form and difficulty, poetic effect should enhance complexity, not replace it, which was kind of in tandem with what you were saying about simile and metaphor. I was just wondering if you could kind of expand a little bit on the idea of complexity in your own work in its relation to form, etc.
Okay. Well, I think that what I mean by that, I think if it's the fragment I recall, what I mean is that just making a formally complex surface does not necessarily make an interesting or complex poem, right? In some ways it's a distraction. And that sometimes a simple poem, formally simple poem with direct utterance is the most complicated of poems because of what it's saying. So I feel that now a lot of times formal tricks or, you know, kind of disrupting of the semantic surface or the linguistic surfaces, which that sounds like gobbledygook. What I mean is like just making a poem in which not direct linear sense is being constructed is taken as complex. And I'm arguing against that and saying that may be the case, or it may not. What is the poem trying to say or do? So you might have a poem like by Jackson McClough, for example, who is a poet I admire, you know, which it's both hard to figure out the formal logic, if there is one, and what the poem is saying, but those two things are connected to each other. And then another one where you feel that that's sort of a device that's distracting from the fact that the poem has nothing to say, right? It's just doing something formal for the sake of it, an empty sense, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.